Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're going to talk about how to inflate anything. Now, this is one of the things that I thought I was using most often, but turns out not really. When I looked back at my projects just to see which ones I should feature in the video or on my reel, I realized that I wasn't really using the cloth simulation that often, which surprised me. And I do use it on my thumbnail a lot, even if I'm not using it to create an animation or anything like that for my reels or for my book reviews. Still, it is a part of my workflow, and I wanted to make a tutorial for it. Now, the first thing that we need to talk about is how to make an object ready for inflating. And that has everything to do with a good topology. So if I, for instance, go over here to add mesh and add a sphere, one of the terrible things about spheres is that their points or their lines meet at the top, making lots of triangles. So if I go to edit mode, all of these are not quads. Everything else is going to inflate nicely except for this top part. This is when things are going to just collapse, or if you inflate it, it's going to inflate and shape itself as a cone from the top. And that's why for cloth simulation, I don't really use a sphere. Let's actually see it, because I think it's better if you see what happens to that point on the top when I add a cloth simulation to it. Now, if I add a cloth simulation to this directly, and you can shade smooth so you don't actually see where the point is, but you're going to be able to figure it out once the cloth simulation runs. So if I hit space to run the simulation, the first thing that is going to happen is that it's going to fall. But we don't want that to happen, and the majority of my projects don't have gravity because I don't really need them to fall. And so the first thing I do is just turn off gravity. Once I do that, if I run it, you're going to see that nothing actually happens. The first thing that I like to do is add pressure. If you want to inflate anything, that's the first thing you want to do, is turn on pressure in the cloth simulation. Okay, with pressure, I've only used two settings. The pressure or the pressure scale value, I know there's a pressure scale over here, but I think this is multiplied by this, and I never really use it, but I use pressure and the vertex group. I always start with a small number. It depends on the scale of your objects and depends on the shrink factor value over here. But I know for the scale of my object, starting with a 2 or a 4 is the best choice, because I do start with templates for my reel reviews on Instagram, because I do have a lighting setup and the book setup and everything. I just need to create the background. And so my scale is always the same. Now, if I run this, you're not going to see that much of a difference, but I think you can see just a little bit of pressure in the beginning added. And the reason for that is because there is no room for the pressure to push the fabric outside, or like what is resembling a fabric right now, because we added a cloth simulation. So if I, let's say, add a vertex group, if I added it to the top, or actually let's hit Option Z or turn on the toggle X-ray over here, I can select the front side and the back side. Because if you go back over here, it's not selected because it wasn't transparent, so it wasn't seeing what we cannot see visually. But now, if I go front view with 1 on a numpad, or if you don't have that, in the preferences, you can turn on the emulate numpad for input. Now, if I select this, we select the entire top edge. Now hit 1, and then I go to over here, what's it called? Object data properties, and then add a vertex group, assign the vertices that I have selected to it. You can call it pin group, you can call it the pressure vertex group. So let's call it pressure, so we know that it's specific to the pressure. And if I go out of edit mode and now I go back to the beginning of the animation, if you hit shift and the left arrow, you'll be able to go back. And actually, if you look down here, you'll probably see the shortcuts, because my screen recorder does add shortcuts over here. Okay, now going back to, or toggling off the X-ray mode, and now run the animation with space, or you can hit run over here or play animation. Now if I run it, nothing will happen because I didn't add it over here. If I go back to pressure and then add this to the vertex group, now the pressure is only going to affect the top half. And if I run it right now, you're going to see it going up because the bulk of the pressure, or the entire pressure basically, is on the top. It's actually too fast, but let's decrease the pressure to 1. I don't know if it's visible or not, but in the beginning, you can actually see this going up a little bit. And then the rest of it continues because of the bat topology. But I think we're going to see it better if I do a negative pressure. So let's do -2. And you know what? Let's add a collision because I think it's going down too fast. So if I add a collision plane, make this a little bit smaller, take it up, select the plane and make it bigger. I don't really use this workflow, but just so you can actually see the bat topology, because I really need you to see that. Add collision and just leave it as is. And now if I run this animation, we're actually going to see how the bat topology of the sphere is going to ruin your mesh. And you can see the cone-like shape over here. There are some artifacts that are making this look even worse because of the lack of self-collision, so it's collapsing on itself. If I remove this and I run this animation again, you can immediately see that it collapses from the center because of the bat topology. So let's just delete it. And then I bring, instead of that, a round cube. And you can find the round cube if you go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then Mesh. You can find the Add Mesh Extra Object. Turn that on. And now if you go to Add, you can actually see Extra Mesh down here. And the most important one that I use most often if I wanted something that resembles a sphere is the round cube. However, the round cube starts with being a cube with some bevel, but if you toggle this on the settings down here, you just hit 1 and you immediately have something resembling a sphere. And if I hit Shade Smooth, we can actually see it better. Now this is better topology because it's all quads. It simply looks nicer, and if I add subdivision surface, it's already looking like a sphere. Let's leave the subdivision for now because I want it to look like the sphere. And then I can go to physics simulations or physics properties and then go to cloth to add a cloth simulation. Immediately you're going to see it fallen because there is gravity and we don't need gravity. I think this still has the collision. Okay, and then make this a little smaller. Now let's add the vertices or the vertex group. Toggle X-ray. Select the top edge only, add the vertex group, call it pressure, and remember to assign it. If you don't do that, then you'll have an empty vertex group. Now go out of edit mode with tab, and then go back to the physics tab, and let's add pressure. Let's add 2, and then pressure. Or actually, let's add -2 because we want it to collapse. And let's remove the X-ray. Now hit space, and you already can see an enhanced collapse because it doesn't have that point on the top or those triangles. And if we remove the vertex for the pressure, you can actually see that it's a little better than the sphere. And if you add a subdivision surface after it, it's actually smoother. Okay, so that's the first thing that you need to know about inflating anything. You have to have good topology. Now let's actually grab an object that I would use to inflate. So we can delete this right now, and we can also delete this one. Now the first thing that I want to add is a cylinder, because I think this is one of the interesting things to inflate usually. And I have used it before, let's say for this thumbnail. I wanted things to mimic curves or waveforms, and that's why I created that, because for the F-curve modifiers, the thumbnail was one of the hardest things to create because I wasn't really creating any objects for it. And so I just needed to figure out a way to portray what I was talking about. And so I created things that has variation in like the exact line or flow of the object. Okay, the first thing that I do is decrease the radius because this is way too big. So let's do it 0.2. And then I increase the depth a little bit. And that's it. And now I rotate it in edit mode just because I don't want to apply the rotation. Rotate on the y-axis at 90 degrees. And I also because of the topology that we talked about, I need to add loops to make this or these lines resemble squares rather than just long rectangles, because it's not going to inflate well. So if I hit Command R and I hover over it, you can actually see it. And if I scroll with my mouse, or if you have a mouse wheel, then you can just scroll that and you'll be able to get a lot of loops. So I'll increase it until I have something resembling squares. I think this is where I like it. And you can either click the mouse again to apply, or you can just hit escape to keep it at the default centered in this area. And now I have a lot of squares. Now this is good topology. I don't really care about the sides that much, just because I'm not really using this area to show you the inflation. But if you want to do something with this, then you can just inset the faces. I do I to inset, that's the shortcut. And then I do it over and over until I get a smaller circle. But I don't merge it in the center, so I don't have something like the sphere, and it'll create a lot of problems. A small circle is fine, and I'll do the same to the other one. And I can shade it smooth or auto smooth because it has some sharp edges that I need to keep, and I only needed to smooth this part of the cylinder. Now let's go to cloth simulation, add a cloth. Immediately it's going to fall because I'm at frame 37 and it does have a gravity. So let's remove the gravity. You can also remove the gravity from here, just toggle this off. But I don't like to do that, or even change how the gravity, or where the gravity is in your project. Right now it's at negative 9.8, which is what we learned in physics. But if you want it to go over here, if you want it to be positive for this one, so it goes up, you can definitely play around with gravity over here. But I like to just remove it from the field weights because I don't want to affect the entire scene, because this will affect the entire scene. I mean, it's called scene properties. Now, if I go to the cloth simulation, add pressure, let's do 4, and I run it, again, nothing will happen. And this is what we're going to talk about next, going to shape. You can actually see the pressure over here, just this bulging a little bit from here and over here. But we need something that looks really nice. So the first thing that I do is go back to the first frame, go to edit mode. You don't even need to go back to the first frame, but usually that lags when I go back to the animation or the simulation. So it's better if you go back to the first frame so the simulation isn't running. And now let's actually add segments or pin groups. So I'll add one over here, select another over here. I'm just doing something arbitrary because I don't have any specific look that I need it. And I like the randomness. And I'm double clicking it. I think if you're on Windows, if you hit Alt and then double click it, it's gonna work. Now I double clicked these to select the entire loop from all sides. I go back to front view, hit 1, and then go to object data properties, add a vertex group, assign it, and then rename it pin because I want it to be the pin group. And then if I go to the cloth simulation and I go down to shape, I can add the pin group over here. And now, even if I have gravity, it's not going to affect the pinned group. So if right now I do this and I run it, you're going to see that they're going to follow the gravity. Of course, we don't have self-collision, so it's going to clip with the rest of the cylinder. But yeah, we don't need gravity over here, and we just need those to be pinned. So if I run the simulation right now without gravity, it's going to be pushed except for the parts that are pinned. However, we don't have enough geometry. I said it, I think, in the geometry nodes tutorial that if you don't have enough fabric to add pressure to it so it inflates outward, then it's not going to look like anything. So the first thing that I do is expand it, but it is using the shrink factor to expand the shape a little bit. Shrinking factor is basically adding shrink to your cloth, but if you go on the negative side, then it adds fabric or it expands the cloth. So if I go to about negative 2.5 or 0.25, that should initially give us a good look. If I run it right now, it should give me something better than before. And now if I, let's say, add maybe 10 for the pressure, let's try it again. Now, this is a little bit better, but if I go over here and I add a subdivision surface, then it's much better. But again, there is a lot of clipping over here because there is no self-collision. Usually when I work, I know how my mesh is going to look just because of how many times I've used this. I don't really need to add self-collision because it slows down the animation. But because I'm trying to show you how it's going to look, I'm going to use self-collision from the beginning. So if I go to collision and then I turn on self-collision, and I always reduce this to 0.001 for distance for self-collision. I don't care about object collisions that often because the majority of the time I'm just using it to collide with itself. And you can even turn off object collisions. I don't think it's going to matter that much unless you want it to collide with an object. And then I increase this to about 7. That's usually my value. And now if I go back to the beginning of the animation and then I run it, we should actually start seeing better results. And if you don't see better results and there's still a lot of clipping, it's also because of the quality step. So if I go up to 20, and that's usually the value that I go up to, or 15, you can also go to 15. And it works fine for me the majority of the time. Now, if I run it, you're gonna see the simulation getting slower. Well, not at the beginning because I've already run it. And the reason for that is because of the quality step. So you're saying do 10 steps instead of 5, which was the initial one. And there's still a lot of clipping going on. So if you go to subdivision, instead of putting it just after to enhance the smoothness of the object, you can also add it beforehand. And I like to make the level viewport and the render levels similar because I've had a lot of problems before when they were different, when I rendered it. Hi, Editing Hadiel here. I thought I needed to explain this further. The reason why, if you render a cloth simulation with a subdivision that is different from the levels in the viewport, what happens is that when the cloth is trying to render, it's seeing that the render value is 2 rather than 1, which is what the cloth simulation is cached based on. And that's why the render looks different. So if you have a level viewport of 1 and you have cached that file already, then you'll have to have the exact same value for render before the cloth simulation. If you have questions, leave them in the comments below and I can explain further. Now, if I go to the beginning and now if I run it, it's going to be much slower, but it's going to give me a little bit better results because it has a lot of mesh before the cloth simulation rather than just having it afterwards. And if I add a subdivision afterward, it's going to smooth down all of these rigid edges. I have to stop the simulation first, so things are much faster. And now I have a subdivision afterwards. And then the last thing that I do, because for something like this, I'm still having a lot of clipping, or it's not really colliding well with itself. Some of the mesh is still going into the other ones beside it. So if I, let's say, stop this animation and I turn on the face orientation, you're gonna see a little bit of red at some areas, and that's how you know there is a lot of mesh that's coming from the inside and going outward. And also if you look over here, because it is kind of resembling a sphere, it's doing this. But if the pressure is done animating, then it's going to look nicer. Let's finish running this simulation and see how it looks in the end. So right now it looks a little bit strange and the pressure over here is not that high. And the shrink factor, the expansion that I've added, is not enough. So sometimes I go back to the shrinking factor and I do negative 0.4. I never really go beyond, let's say, 0.6 or negative 0.6 because then it starts to really lag and it doesn't look that nice. But you can definitely try it out. So if I run this right now, again, it's much slower. So sometimes what I do is to disable the subdivision beforehand, go back to the beginning, and just run the animation, not caring much about how it looks in the final render. And that's how I usually work. I don't work with the final renders look all the time. I kind of have a visual of how it's going to look in the end, so it doesn't really matter. And you can see it's much faster without that subdivision. Okay, it looks more like an inflatable. Now, because we do have just a small pin area, it's going to look like this. I'm going to keep the face orientation on just so I am able to see if there is a little bit of the inside coming out, because right here, I thought this was clipping, but it isn't. It's just the mesh itself collapsing on itself. And I can later, when I cache it, render at a higher quality step and a higher collision quality. But if you want to keep the collision quality the same, because you don't want to slow the animation, you can definitely add keyframes to your pressure. And that way the pressure is not suddenly increasing. And also do the same for the shrink factor. Because let's say I don't have pressure and I just look at the shrink factor animation, the majority of the time, that's what's creating the problem. Because it's increasing the fabric beyond its points or its original size, and that creates a lot of collision. So let's go back and let's start by animating the shrink factor first. I'll start with 0, or let's start at 20 with this value, insert keyframe, and then go back over here, make it a 0, insert keyframe, and now I have a slower expansion, which is much better, as you can see, when it comes to how these are not collapsing on themselves. So we actually see a difference in the results. And if I add pressure right now, the pressure is added as the shrinking factor going up. And you can definitely add more pressure. Let's go up to 20 and let's add it as an animation. I can do the same thing, start with the 20, at 20 frames. You can also make it different from the shrinking factor values or position, and then go back to 0, insert a keyframe on the first frame. And now both of them are slower and you get to see how things are actually inflating. Let's even go lower at 30 frames, -0.6, insert a keyframe. At this point, you always have to save, because if you don't, you're going to find a lot of problems with your animation. And you can see this part is actually going up, when before it was just going into this other part of the mesh and this part of the mesh. But now it's actually a little bit more realistic. Sure, we do have a little bit of the normal coming out from the inside over here, but that won't look bad when you cache it later with more subdivision. So if I go back right now to here and turn on the subdivision, I can actually see the animation better. But as you can see, it's much slower. But immediately we're seeing a lot of wrinkles over here and it's a little bit more realistic. Let's actually remove the subdivision over here, and I'll go back not to edit mode, but to weight paint mode, because I've noticed that in these two areas, the pin group is a lot larger. So what I'm going to do is go back to the pin group over here, go to edit mode, and you can go to edit mode with tab from anywhere that is in edit mode. So I'll go to edit mode, and now I'll select this one. Okay, now I have these two, and I'm going to decrease the weight a little bit. Let's make it 0.7 maybe, and then assign it back. So now these two are 0.7, and if I go out of edit modes back to weight paints mode, we're going to see there isn't a red part, because the red is basically a weight of 1 and the blue is a weight of 0. So if I increase this, then we get the transition from the red to the blue, but not necessarily the red, because we don't have it at 1. Now if I go back to object mode, and now if I run the cloth simulation, you'll see a change in the way these collapse, because it has a weight that is a little bit lower, and so the strength of the pinning is not as high as the ones on the side. Okay, let's delete this, and I'll add a text, because I think that's important when it comes to inflation and the topology of it, because this is just an object that I've used from Blender itself. But if I delete this right now, and then I add what I exported as an SVG into Blender. So import SVG, you can create SVGs anywhere. I do mine in Illustrator. And if you go back to the first tutorial of this set of tutorials, you'll be able to see how I export my SVGs from Illustrator and import them into Blender. But now I'm going to just import it, and I'm going to the file where I saved my SVG. I have it over here, import SVG, and you'll see that it's a lot of vertices. You won't be able to see it because it's extremely small, as you can see over here. Now I select everything. You can either select it with Shift and select, or you can right click on the collection and click select objects. And this way you're selecting everything for sure, especially if you don't want to go down if you have a lot of objects. And now I am going to rotate it on the x-axis 90 degrees, go to the front with 1. Let's hide the camera from the view. And then I'm going to set the origin to geometry. So each of the origins are going to their respective letters. And now let's bring it to the center and scale it up. Now, right now, if I go to edit mode, it's just a curve. So we're not really seeing faces on here. It's just one face. So I'm just going to go out of edit mode. And the first thing I do is go to geometry because this doesn't have any geometry right now. And I increased this to 0.01, I think, even less than that, 0.001. I believe the extrude value changes based on the scale, but I'm not sure. I haven't tested that out. So if the value that I put doesn't work with you the same way, then make sure to test different values until you get something visually similar to mine if you're trying to follow along. And then because everything is selected, which is a tip that I've shared before, I can just go to copy to selected, and it'll copy the same setting to all of the selected. Let's remove the face orientation so we can actually see better. And I'm going to also go to the materials property, remove the SVG material that we have because it's black since I colored my SVG in Illustrator black, and that's why it's that color. You can definitely just make it white over here, and let's do that for now. But what I usually do is just remove this, add a new material, or leave it with no materials because then it's just a clay texture. But I'll just add a regular material for later. And now I have some geometry. It's still not showing in edit mode because technically this is still a curve. But sometimes I also add a little bit of depth or bevel, and a little as in 0.0001. And you can see the bevel, it's better than the other ones. And now because everything is selected, I'm going to copy to selected from the active. You can now adjust some of your lettering if some of them are touching the other parts, just for the cloud simulation. And you can, to select all of the connected parts, you can just hit L on these, same for here and the same for here, and then hit G on the x-axis just a little bit until it's not touching the T. Everything else is fine. After that, I either select everything and convert it to mesh, which is better because you don't have to apply modifiers to it. So let's do that first. And then I add the remesh modifier, but I did this before because I want you to see the topology and how terrible it is if you just convert to mesh from a curve. Now this is not going to inflate well at all because there are a lot of triangles that don't look good. And so the first thing I do is remesh my object. I just add a remesh modifier. I don't use the remesh on the object, I think, or here. It's the object data properties. There is a remesh that you can do, but this is not a modifier, so you cannot delete it later on if you don't want it. Because sometimes I just think of inflating an object and I add the remesh and then I rethink my idea and I don't inflate it anymore. And so I can later delete the remesh, or I create a backup of my curves. Now what I like to do is use either sharp or smooth. And if you want to see the mesh, if you go to edit mode, you're not going to see it. But if you want to see it, you can just go to overlays over here and add wireframe. I do decrease the opacity a little bit, but I'm going to keep it at 0.5 just so you can see it in the video. If I go to sharp, it's much better. The only problem is it's not keeping the bevel that well. So the bevel is looking a little strange. But if I go to smooth, then it's kind of similar to voxel, but as you add more information, it's much better. And this is how it's going to look in sharp. They share the depth values. So if you add 7 over here and you go to smooth, it's going to be the same. I like smooth much better, even the topology is nicer. And then I do Command L or Control L on Windows, and I copy modifiers. You have to select everything, and the active one is the one that you're copying from. So I'll just copy modifier, and you can definitely see more about this in my duplicate objects and copying data tutorial from this series. I'll link to everything I mentioned down below, and probably in the I part over here on the top. Okay, so now we have good topology for all of them. It's a little bit much, so if I go down to 6, I think that's going to look nice as well, because we're inflating it, so it doesn't really matter. And then I'm copying to selected for this value to apply to all of them. And I also like to remove disconnected or uncheck remove disconnected, because I don't want it to remove. For instance, the dot on the I is removed because of the remove disconnected. So anything that is not connected to itself is going to be removed. So I just uncheck this, and it's not going to show the I because we haven't copied it to the selected. Because again, everything I do is just done to the active. Copy to selected, and immediately I get to see the full I. Now I have a good mesh to inflate. But because I want to pin my object, I cannot not apply the remesh. So at this point, if you want to pin your mesh, you can just create a copy of this and put it in a hidden collection. And that is going to be your backup if anything terrible happens to this, but we're fine. I'm just going to apply the mesh because we want to go to edit mode. It only applied it to the first one, but what I do is if I want to apply all of the modifiers to all of the objects that are selected, not just the active one, I just right click, convert to mesh, and it immediately applies all of the modifiers on it. So even if I go to this one, it's applied. And now I can go to edit mode, or what I like to do is just join all of the mesh into one. So I just hit Command J in object mode, and then I go to edit mode. Well, you can see that the ends could have used less in the remesh depth, but that's fine. I can now go to edit mode, and I hit, instead of 1 for front view, I want to pin the back side and I want to inflate the front side. So I'm going to just hit Command 1 or Control 1 on a Windows, and I get the back side of it, and I just select the back side and make sure that you're not in X-ray mode. And then I add a vertex group, call it pin, and assign it. Now if I go to 1, you can actually see that nothing in the front is selected. There is some parts on the sides that are selected on some of the mesh. If you want to clean that up, you can, but I'm okay with it being like this because I'm only inflating it from the front, and it's going to hide all of that, or all of those edges in the back, so we don't mind. And now I go out of edit mode, and we can add a cloth modifier. It's lagging because it's on the 34th frame. So let's go back to the first frame, and because it also has gravity. Let's remove the gravity. It's a lot heavier because there's a lot of mesh over here. And let's add the pin group, and finally add some pressure. Or not finally, because we're going to add some expansion to the shape. So if I go back a little bit, negative 0.28 is what we're going to start with. And now I'm going to run this. Well, I'm going to save it first because usually that's the part when things just start crashing. Yeah, and one more thing, when you're joining your objects, then you don't also need to add collision to every object, because before, if you had everything separate, if you want it to collide with each other, then you're going to have to add collision to each one of them on top of the cloth modifier. But when I join them, I only turn on the self collision and it works. Okay, so it's already inflated, but because we don't have enough pressure and because we don't have self collision, it's looking a little weird. And because we haven't shaded smooth. Let's remove or reduce the opacity for the wireframe. Okay, now if I go from the sides and look at the back side, it's all pinned and things just inflated in the front. Now if I want this to look better, I can just add self-collision, 0.001, which is the lowest I think it can go. And then go up to 7 on this one, go up to 15 on this one, save it, go back to the first frame and run it again. It's going to be extremely slow, And that's what we're going to talk about next. But before we do that, let's just add a subdivision surface after the cloth simulation. You can see it's much smoother now. And the reason why it's wrinkly is because there isn't enough pressure for the expansion that we added to inflate this well. So you can just add a little bit more pressure. Let's add up to 10. And then let's talk about caching. So if things are extremely slow like this, and especially when I want a specific frame and I don't know which one I want, I need to cache my animation. And of course, when I render, sometimes certain things just lag and it slows down the render for me. I don't know if that's the normal thing, but I've noticed that my renders are much slower if I don't cache my animation. So what I do next is open the cache toggle and change the start of the simulation and the end. Usually it's 250 because that's the default length of an animation, but you can definitely reduce that to, let's say, 30, because that's usually when I find my inflation has completed. And then I just do bake. And you can see the cache progress down here and also on the Blender icon. And I just wait for it to render or cache, and I'll definitely speed this up for the video. So you're gonna see things going much faster, but it is much slower for me. So I just wait for it. I either read something or go on my phone and come back to it when it's done. Okay, so it took about 4 minutes to render, I think. And now the first thing I do is save it, because the amount of times my computer has crashed after caching something like this and running it is just strangely too many. So save it first and then go back to the first frame and run it. Also, I like to make the length of the animation itself 30, or the amount of cache I have, because I want to see it looping. Because once it reaches the 30 frame, it'll just stop animating, and it's just annoying to see it that way. So I want to see it how it animates over and over again. So for it to loop, I'm just cutting it off at 30. And now if I run it, we can actually see the animation much faster. And it also allowed me to see that the pressure is somewhat enough. So if I want to use this frame, I can convert it to mesh, or because I don't want the subdivision over here to apply, I can just apply the cloth simulation at the frame I want, and that will keep this as a mesh. So sometimes I do use the cloth simulation to model something that looks like a balloon, or I don't know, fabric that is stuffed. I can also show you how to compress something that you're inflating inside of a frame that you don't have to show it, but there are a lot of tutorials out there that show that. But just as a recap for all of those tutorials, you can simply add, let's say, a cube and remove its front face, let's say. Well, just remove faces. And then make it smaller. And then you can inflate this without pinning even. And the letters will just collide with the outside object, that it's not going to fly everywhere. And then you can either make this glass, or you can just hide it over here. I can just remove it from render view. So we can keep it in the viewport, and you can definitely hide it over here, and it's still going to be active in the animation. But usually I want to see how it's colliding with the object, especially if I want the camera to be the bounds of this. And I want to know if it's going outside of the box, just in case I needed to fix the collision. And of course, you'll have to add collision to this box. But now, because our mesh is already cached, it's not going to be affected by the collider object that we just added, so it's not important at this stage. But if you wanted to add it, you're gonna have to delete the bake for this and add the collider object and then recache everything. So that's what a lot of tutorials have been making lately for inflating text specifically. But I like to just pin it in the background and inflate it, and you can actually see it in the background looking a little strange. And then you can definitely add any texture to it. I like to add plasticky material if I'm not going to add any PBR textures. So I definitely decrease the roughness a lot. And let's go to the camera view It's extremely small, and we cannot really make it bigger. I didn't explain this, so I think it requires an explanation. This doesn't scale up if you cache the simulation. So if you want to rescale it, you either have to apply the cloth simulation, or you can scale it and then recache it. So you'll have to delete the bake before you change the scale, because once you run the simulation, when it's cached, then it's going to go back to the previous scale because that's what is cached. So let's apply the cloth, increase this. Now let's go to the materials tab, and I decreased the roughness already. We can definitely remove the overlay so we can see it better. And then we can change the color to, let's say, green. The reason why this happened is because I added the material before I joined everything. And so it considered this a separate object that had a material that I didn't apply to the rest. So the rest still has the SVG material, because when you combine objects with different materials, it creates a different slot and it selects those for that material. So let's just remove this, and voila, everything is just green now. Or you can do bubblegum pink. That's my favorite. I never was a pink fan, but for some reason, I'm just all of the colors fan right now. I don't really have a favorite color anymore. Imagine how this is going to look if you add hair particles to it and knit materials and just any weave material or fabric with a lot of different colors that are out of this world gorgeous. As per usual, I'm going to create my thumbnail and get back to you with the explanation. It's going to be just seconds later. Okay, let's go through the thumbnail. Let's start with the easiest one. For the text we did together, so I don't think I need to explain that one. For this one, the blobs over here, I did the same as this. I just imported an SVG that I created in Illustrator and inflated it exactly like the text. I did the remesh and fixed the topology of it, and if I go into edit mode, we can actually see it. And I cached everything, so even if I go into edit mode, it's not going to explode on me. And then because I usually create frames with my shapes for these thumbnails, I just created a curve over here, added some depth to it, and converted it into a mesh. And then I added some pin groups all over the place, but I also added some weight paint. So I just painted things randomly, and I pinned the backside so the inflation just goes to the front and it's not wasted on the back, which we're not seeing, so it doesn't really matter. And then these are looking a little strange because I have used the weight paint tool with some different strengths, and so it's giving some green over here, which has less pinning, and then there are some greens over here, splashes of green over here as well, and that will create a different pinning value or strength. And that's basically it for that one. If I go back to object mode and go to this one, you'll notice that I have a collider object, or something that my cloth is going to collide with. And then I created just a tube. I think if I go to edit mode, you should be able to see it. But I had to push it away from these parts of the collision, because when you have your cloth intersecting with the collider object, it always keeps that collision. It doesn't really just snaps out of it. And I'm not sure if I added collision from the inside of the mesh as well is going to help it, because there is this setting over here in the collision that allows me to uncheck the single-sided, so even the inside parts or the backside of the normal is going to interact and still collide. But to be safe, because I know I didn't care about the initial shape of it, I just removed it so it's not colliding. And then I expanded it with the shrink factor until it filled the space. I do have some collider objects on the front face and the back side as well. I think it's this one. And although I do have that, it's not looking flat. It's not colliding well, and I didn't really care about that. I just needed it to fit in that space and not fly away. So I just added that collider just to keep it in. And so even the parts that are going to expand beyond that collider object or that surface is fine by me, because what I'm trying to achieve isn't necessarily a flat surface or a flat cloth. And finally, I did this one because I got a question about how I created my book review for The Martian, like the backdrop of it. So if I go into edit mode, we can actually see what is happening. It's just a round cube with some lines going through it that I created with a knife tool. And I just created some curvy lines that I used as the pin group. And this is what it gave me in the end. And then the backdrop or the background in general, I simply inflated it. And because the normal in the back is the red part and this is the front face, it's going to inflate to this side without even adding a wind to it from the back. But if you want to add wind, you can. It's just going to make your collision much worse, or it's going to need a lot of collision quality added, or you'll have to make the animation really, really slow and then make it faster later after caching it when you're editing your video. But what I did is just inflated this and added some pins. If I go to here, select the pin so I can actually see what parts are pinned. You can actually see this part is pinned or the edges, and then the book part is pinned as well. Because I didn't want it to collide with the book, it's too far away and it's not going to look as if this part is framing the entire or the title in the book. So I just added a pin group over there just to give it a little bit more shadow and to add more emphasis on the foreground rather than on the background. And I kept the hair particle system from the previous thumbnail from the hair particles video because I really liked it. I just changed the color. And if we look at the materials, we have a variation of materials. I added some foil material because I liked how wrinkly these were. I mean, these are a mistake in general because it's not just the parts that are not pinned that are bulging like this and looking a little strange, because even with the text, we do have the same problem. If we go over here, you can actually see it. And that's because it's not pinning right or it's not colliding. So it just needs a little bit more quality, I think. What I mean is that you need to increase the quality steps. That's what I was talking about. And I think it should fix it. I'm not sure. But try it out. I mean, I liked the look, so I just kept it as is. But usually when I pin something, it doesn't really do that. But maybe with more pressure, it's going to create something a little strange. And that's why I added the foil material for it. But I also added some texture to it with Voronoi and a bump right here. And then this is just a normal material. I didn't even change the roughness, I just changed the color. And for this, I also have a bump on it with a Voronoi texture, just to give the foil material or the silvery material some texture, because if I remove this, we're gonna have just a normal silver material, but with bump, it just adds a little bit more to the reflections of the cloth. And I think with cloth especially, you can play around with the materials because it has a lot of variation in its shape. So something like this has a lot of shadows over here and then some bulging over here. So even the way it reflects light is going to be varied, and that will allow you to even add the Fresnel or facing, because it depends on what the light is reflecting or what parts are facing the camera right now. And that will give you variation in the color like I'm doing over here. So these parts, because they're facing me, they're more silver, and then the parts that are not are more red. And then the same goes for this one as well. I just like to play with layer weight, especially with cloth when it comes to materials. We'll talk more about materials later on in the texture and materials tutorial. I think it's the letter T if I'm phrasing it right. But yeah, that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you found it helpful. See you next week. Bye.